The moment someone shows you who they really are is rarely loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper. I remember thinking that as I stood beside my husband's casket on a quiet gray morning in late October, the kind of cold Connecticut morning where the air smells like fallen leaves and damp stone. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old. And the day we buried my husband Daniel was the day I realized grief was not the only thing waiting for me at that funeral. The small white church in our town had filled quickly that morning. People who had known Daniel for decades sat shoulder to shoulder in the wooden pews, coats folded over their laps, their voices soft and respectful. Daniel had lived in this town his entire life. He built things here, fixed things for people who couldn't afford repairs, and spent 35 years teaching shop class at the local high school. If something broke in town, someone usually said the same thing: call Dan Whitmore. Now he was lying in a polished oak casket at the front of the room, and for the first time in 30 years I felt completely alone. I stood near the casket greeting people as they approached. Friends squeezed my hands, neighbors hugged me, and former students told stories about how Daniel had helped them build their first bookshelf or repair their first truck engine. I tried to smile through the sadness because Daniel would have wanted kindness in that room, not despair. But there was one person whose presence made the air around me feel colder than the autumn wind outside. My stepdaughter, Ashley Whitmore. Ashley was 32 now, tall, perfectly dressed in black, and performing grief the way someone might perform a role in a stage play. She hugged relatives, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and spoke in a gentle voice that sounded convincing enough if you didn't know her well. I had been part of her life since she was 19, ever since Daniel and I married, but there had always been distance between us, a polite barrier neither of us ever truly crossed. She had never been openly cruel, never dramatic, never explosive. Ashley's way was quieter than that. Calculated. Patient. And as the service came to an end and people began lining up to say their final goodbyes, she stepped closer. To the casket beside me. For a moment she looked down at her father's face, her expression blank and unreadable. Then she leaned slightly toward me, close enough that no one else could hear her voice. Her words were soft, almost gentle, the kind of whisper meant to sound comforting. "Don't worry," she said calmly. "The house will finally belong to us." For a second I thought I must have heard her wrong. The words didn't belong in that room, not beside the man we had just lost. My heart thudded hard in my chest as I slowly turned my head to look at her. Ashley had already straightened up again, her expression shifting smoothly back into the face of a grieving daughter. She reached out and squeezed my arm as if offering sympathy. Anyone watching would have thought she was comforting me. But in that moment I felt something colder than grief move through my chest. Because Ashley wasn't mourning her father. She was already thinking about the house he left behind. For the rest of the service I could not hear the pastor clearly, even though he stood less than 10 feet away from me. My mind stayed fixed on the quiet sentence Ashley had whispered only moments earlier. "The house will finally belong to us." The words echoed in my thoughts in a way that felt strange and out of place, like someone discussing business during a prayer. Daniel and I had lived in that house for 28 years. It was a 2-story colonial with pale blue shutters, sitting on half an acre just outside town. Daniel planted the maple tree in the front yard the first summer we moved in. He built the wooden porch swing himself a year later. That house was not simply a property. It was where our life happened. When the final hymn ended, people began slowly walking toward the front to say their last goodbye. I stayed where I was, my hands folded together, trying to steady my breathing. One by one they approached the casket. Old friends from Daniel's fishing club. Former students who were now grown men with families of their own. Several of them placed small folded notes beside Daniel's hands. One young man whispered that Daniel had once stayed after school 3 hours to help him finish a project because he did not have a father at home to teach him how to use tools. I nodded and thanked each person, but part of my attention stayed fixed on Ashley standing only a few feet away. She moved through the room gracefully, greeting people, accepting condolences, and speaking softly about how proud her father had been of the community. Anyone watching would have believed she was the devoted daughter of a beloved man. But every time our eyes met, I noticed the faintest hint of something else behind her expression. Not sadness. Anticipation. After the service ended, we gathered outside near the church steps while the funeral director prepared the vehicles for the short drive to the cemetery. The sky had grown darker, thick clouds drifting slowly over the town like a blanket. I wrapped my coat tighter around my shoulders as people continued offering quiet words of sympathy. Ashley stood nearby speaking with one of Daniel's cousins, her voice calm and polite. Then she glanced toward me again. For a brief second her polite smile faded. In its place was something sharper, almost like the look someone gives when they believe the outcome of a long game is already decided. Later that afternoon, after the burial, several relatives planned to come to the house for coffee and a simple meal. It was a tradition in our town after funerals, a way for people to sit together and remember the person they lost. Daniel had always respected those traditions. I had spent the night before preparing what I could, setting out dishes and arranging chairs even though my hands had trembled the entire time. The thought of returning to the house without Daniel already felt heavy enough. Now another thought had quietly joined it. Ashley believed the house was already hers. And the strange thing was not that she believed it. The strange thing was how certain she sounded when she said it. The drive from the church to the cemetery took less than 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. I sat in the back seat of the car the funeral director provided, my hands folded in my lap as the quiet town roads passed slowly outside the window. The trees along the street had already begun losing their leaves, thin branches stretching against the gray sky like tired fingers. Daniel used to love this time of year. Every fall he would rake the leaves into huge piles in the front yard and laugh like a boy when the neighborhood children jumped into them. I could almost hear that laughter now, but the seat beside me was empty. When we reached the cemetery, people stepped out of their cars and gathered near the freshly prepared site. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the grass still held drops of moisture that clung to the edges of everyone's shoes. The pastor spoke again, his voice gentle and steady as he read a short passage about memory and legacy. I tried to focus on his words, but my mind continued drifting back to Ashley's whisper inside the church. The house will finally belong to us. The sentence did not sound like grief. It sounded like a plan already completed. After the final prayer, people stepped forward to place flowers beside the casket before it was lowered. One by one they approached, pausing quietly, then stepping away. When Ashley's turn came, she stood there longer than most. She looked down at the casket, her face still and composed. Then she placed a single white rose beside the others and stepped back without saying a word. From a distance she looked like a devoted daughter honoring her father. But when she turned around and our eyes met again, I felt that same quiet certainty in her gaze. As if she believed everything that mattered had already shifted in her favor. Once the service ended, many of the guests prepared to leave, but a small group followed me back to the house for the gathering I had mentioned earlier. Daniel's cousin Robert drove behind me, and two of our neighbors followed as well. Ashley arrived shortly after we did, stepping out of her car with calm confidence, adjusting her coat as if she were arriving at a routine family dinner instead of the end of her father's funeral. Inside the house, the familiar scent of coffee and baked bread filled the kitchen. I had prepared everything the night before, arranging simple dishes on the long dining table Daniel built himself 15 years earlier. The same table where we celebrated birthdays, holidays, and countless quiet Sunday dinners. People moved through the room slowly, speaking in low voices, remembering stories about Daniel. For a while I allowed myself to focus on those memories. But eventually I noticed Ashley standing near the large living room window, looking out at the front yard where the maple tree Daniel planted all those years ago now towered over the lawn. She studied the house in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly. Not like a daughter remembering childhood moments, more like someone measuring something that already belonged to them. And as I watched her, I began to realize that whatever Ashley believed about that house, she seemed very certain that I was not part of the future she had imagined. The house slowly filled with the quiet sounds that follow a funeral gathering, the soft clinking of coffee cups, chairs shifting across the hardwood floor, and low conversations that drifted from one room to another like gentle echoes. Daniel always said our home felt warmer when people filled it with stories, and that afternoon many of those stories were about him. Robert stood near the kitchen counter explaining how Daniel once drove nearly 40 miles during a snowstorm to help repair a broken furnace. One of our neighbors laughed softly while remembering how Daniel insisted on teaching half the neighborhood children how to build birdhouses one summer. Listening to them should have comforted me, and in some ways it did, But beneath those memories, another awareness stayed quietly present in my mind. Ashley moved through the house differently than the others. While our guests lingered near the dining table or sat together in the living room, she walked slowly from space to space, pausing to observe things with careful attention. I watched her stand beside the bookshelf Daniel built along the hallway wall, running her fingers lightly across the polished wood as if testing its condition. A few minutes later, she stepped into the dining room and studied the long oak table where people now sat with plates and cups. She looked at the staircase as she passed it, then at the framed photographs along the wall. Anyone else might have thought she was remembering the past, but there was something deliberate in the way her eyes moved across each corner of the house. Eventually, she joined me in the kitchen while I refilled the coffee pot. Her voice sounded calm and almost thoughtful when she spoke. She asked how long Daniel and I had owned the house, and whether we had ever considered remodeling the upstairs bathroom. The questions were casual, but they carried a strange kind of focus that did not quite belong in the middle of a day like this. I answered politely because I did not want to create tension in front of our guests, but inside I could not forget the whisper she had spoken at the church. At one point, she leaned slightly against the counter and looked toward the window that faced the backyard. The maple tree outside swayed gently in the afternoon wind, its leaves scattered across the grass Daniel used to rake every autumn. Ashley studied that yard for several quiet seconds before speaking again. She mentioned how valuable homes in this neighborhood had become over the past few years, and how several houses nearby had sold for impressive prices. Her tone remained light, almost conversational, yet every word seemed to circle back toward the same unspoken idea: the house. Later, while guests continued sharing stories in the living room, I stepped onto the back porch for a moment of quiet air. The wooden swing Daniel built creaked softly in the wind as it moved back and forth. I sat there for a moment, letting the cool October air clear my thoughts. When I finally looked through the kitchen window again, I saw Ashley standing alone near the dining table, glancing around the room in a way that made something inside me settle into place. It was the look of someone already imagining the future of a house they believed would soon belong to them. And as I watched her from the porch, I began to understand that whatever Ashley believed about Daniel's home, she was absolutely convinced that I would not be living in it for much longer. By late afternoon, the house had grown quieter as people slowly began gathering their coats and preparing to leave. The sky outside had turned a deeper shade of gray, and the wind had picked up just enough to send small spirals of dry leaves rolling across the driveway. One by one, our guests stepped toward the front door, offering gentle hugs and kind words before heading home. Robert was the last of Daniel's relatives to leave, squeezing my shoulder and telling me that if I ever needed help with anything around the house, he would only be a phone call away. I thanked him sincerely because I knew he meant every word. When the door finally closed behind him, the silence that settled over the house felt heavier than any moment earlier that day. For the first time since morning, the rooms were no longer filled with voices remembering Daniel. It was just me and Ashley. She stood near the living room window again, arms folded loosely as she looked out toward the front yard. The maple tree moved gently in the wind, its branches scratching softly against the cool autumn air. I began clearing a few empty cups from the coffee table, trying to focus on simple tasks that would steady my thoughts. After a moment, Ashley turned away from the window and walked slowly toward the dining room where the long oak table still held several plates and half-empty cups. She looked around the room as if noticing the house in a different way now that the guests were gone. Her voice was calm when she finally spoke. She mentioned that the house had always been beautiful, and that her father had clearly taken good care of it over the years. I nodded politely, placing dishes into the sink, but I could sense the direction her thoughts were moving even before she continued speaking. She commented on the size of the property and how desirable the neighborhood had become. Then she casually mentioned that houses on our street were now selling for far more than they had even 5 years earlier. Her words were smooth and thoughtful, but the conversation felt less like remembrance and more like quiet evaluation. After a brief pause, she stepped closer to the dining table and ran her hand lightly along the polished wood Daniel had finished himself. She said something about how families often had to make practical decisions after someone passed away. Sometimes homes were too large for one person, she explained gently, especially for someone my age. Her tone sounded reasonable, almost sympathetic, but beneath it was the same certainty I had noticed earlier in the church. as if she believed the conclusion had already been reached and we were simply approaching the moment when I would finally understand it. I dried my hands slowly with a kitchen towel before turning to face her fully. The house around us felt different now, quieter and more still, like it was waiting for the next conversation to reveal something important. And in that moment I realized Ashley was no longer speaking in hints or suggestions. She was carefully guiding the conversation toward the future she had already imagined. A future where Daniel's house would belong to her, and where my place inside these walls was slowly disappearing. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet inside the house felt thicker than it had all day. The kind of silence that settles after a storm when everything waits to see what will happen next. Ashley stood beside the dining table with one hand resting lightly on the polished oak surface, her posture relaxed and confident. I could see in her expression that she believed she had already begun a conversation that would end exactly the way she expected. I folded the kitchen towel slowly and placed it on the counter before walking into the dining room so we stood only a few feet apart. The late afternoon light coming through the window cast long shadows across the floor, stretching the shape of the maple tree branches across the wall like quiet reminders of all the years Daniel and I had lived here. Ashley spoke again in the same calm tone she had used earlier, explaining that after a loss like this families often needed to think about practical matters. She mentioned property taxes, maintenance, and the effort required to care for a house this size. Her words sounded reasonable on the surface, but every sentence circled back toward the same idea. She believed the house would eventually become hers. I listened without interrupting, watching the steady confidence in her face as she continued outlining what she called sensible options. At one point she suggested that perhaps selling the house might make things easier for everyone involved. The money could be divided and used in ways that made more sense for the future. She spoke about it as if the decision were simply a matter of timing, something that would naturally happen once the initial sadness had passed. I let her finish speaking before responding. My voice remained calm because raising it would have accomplished nothing. I told her that Daniel and I had built our life inside these walls, and that the house carried decades of memories that could not be measured by property values. Ashley nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she believed emotion would eventually give way to practicality. She reminded me that circumstances change and that people must sometimes accept new realities whether they feel ready or not. There was a quiet certainty in the way she said those words, as if she believed the future had already been decided somewhere beyond this room. I studied her carefully then, noticing the patience in her posture and the confidence in her eyes. Ashley had not come to this conversation unprepared. She had been thinking about this moment long before the funeral took place. As the silence returned between us, I realized something important. Ashley believed she understood exactly how this story would unfold. She believed that time, pressure, and practicality would eventually push me toward the same conclusion she had already reached. But what she did not understand yet was that Daniel had never been the kind of man who left important things to chance. And neither had I. That evening after Ashley left, the house finally became quiet in a way it had not been all day. The last car disappeared down the street, the distant sound of its engine fading until only the wind and the soft creak of the porch swing remained. I stood for a long moment in the living room, looking around at the familiar space Daniel and I had shared for nearly 3 decades. The photographs on the wall showed vacations, birthdays, and small ordinary days that once felt endless. The house did not feel like property to me, felt like history. Yet Ashley's words had changed the atmosphere of the day in a way I could not ignore. She believed the future of this house had already been decided, and the calm certainty in her voice suggested she was waiting for something specific to happen. I slowly began clearing the remaining dishes from the dining table, stacking plates carefully as I carried them into the kitchen. The simple rhythm of washing and drying helped quiet my thoughts, but one question remained steady in my mind. Why had Ashley sounded so sure? Daniel had always been a careful man when it came to responsibility. He believed in planning for the future, and making sure nothing important was left unclear. During the final years of his life we had occasionally discussed paperwork, legal documents, and practical matters that people tend to avoid until they realize time is moving faster than expected. I remembered one particular evening about 3 years earlier when we sat together on the back porch watching the sun drop behind the maple tree. Daniel had spoken quietly about making sure everything was properly arranged so no confusion would exist after he was gone. At the time I did not want to think about that possibility, but Daniel insisted that avoiding difficult conversations never helped anyone. As I dried the last coffee cup and placed it in the cabinet, that memory returned with new clarity. Daniel had not been the kind of man who left decisions unfinished. If Ashley believed the house would eventually belong to her, she must have based that belief on something she thought she understood. Perhaps she assumed that as his daughter she would automatically inherit everything. Perhaps someone had told her something that gave her confidence. Or perhaps she had simply convinced herself that time and pressure would eventually push me out of the picture. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the hallway toward the small study at the back of the house. Daniel used that room for paperwork, letters, and the occasional project he liked to sketch out on weekends. The desk lamp still sat exactly where he left it, beside a neat stack of folders arranged with the same careful order he always preferred. I stood there for a moment, looking at the quiet room, and realized something that made my breathing steady again. Ashley believed the future of this house was already decided, but she had forgotten one important detail about the man who built it. Daniel never left important things to assumptions. The study smelled faintly of old paper, and the cedar polish Daniel liked to use on his desk every spring. I stepped inside slowly and turned on the small lamp in the corner, letting its warm light settle across the room. The desk looked exactly the way Daniel always kept it, everything neat, everything placed with quiet intention. Daniel believed that if something mattered, it deserved to be organized properly. For a few minutes I simply stood there remembering the many evenings he spent at that desk paying bills, writing letters to old friends, or sketching small projects he planned to build someday. The silence in the room felt calmer than the rest of the house, as if this space still carried his steady presence. Eventually I sat down in the chair across from the desk and opened the top drawer where he kept important documents. Inside were several folders labeled in his careful handwriting. Insurance papers, property tax records, maintenance notes about the roof and the furnace. Daniel had always believed that a well-run household required attention to details most people ignored. As I moved through the folders one by one, a memory returned to me with greater clarity. About a year before his health began to decline, Daniel had insisted that we meet with an attorney in town. At the time I remember telling him that it seemed unnecessary because we had lived such a simple life. Daniel smiled the way he often did when he knew something important needed to be done regardless of how uncomfortable it felt. He said that clarity protected people from misunderstandings later. That conversation had lasted less than an hour, but afterward Daniel seemed satisfied that everything had been arranged the right way. As I reached the bottom of the drawer I noticed a thicker envelope placed neatly beneath the other folders. My name was written on the front in Daniel's handwriting. Seeing it there made my chest tighten for a moment, because Daniel rarely wrote anything without careful thought. I lifted the envelope slowly and turned it over in my hands. It had clearly been placed there intentionally, waiting for the moment when it might finally be needed. I did not open it right away. Instead I leaned back in the chair and looked around the quiet study again, remembering the conversation Daniel and I had shared on the back porch that evening years earlier. He had spoken calmly about making sure no one could pressure me or confuse me after he was gone. At the time I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood that Daniel had been thinking much further ahead than I realized. Ashley believed the future of this house was already decided. She believed time and practicality would eventually move everything in her favor. But as I held that envelope with my name written across the front, I felt something settle quietly inside my chest. Daniel had known exactly what kind of situation might one day unfold inside this house, and he had prepared for it long before anyone else realized it would matter. I sat in Daniel's chair for a long time before opening the envelope. The lamp on the desk cast a warm circle of light across the wood surface, and outside the study window the evening wind continued moving through the branches of the maple tree in the yard. The rest of the house was quiet now, the kind of deep quiet that only arrives after a long day filled with people and memories. My fingers rested on the edge of the envelope while I looked at the familiar handwriting of my husband's name written beneath mine in the corner. Daniel had always believed that words written carefully mattered more than words spoken quickly, and the weight of that thought settled over me as I finally slid my finger under the sealed edge and opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller document tucked neatly behind it. I unfolded the letter first. Daniel's handwriting filled the page in the steady, patient script, I had watched him use for nearly 30 years. The first line alone made my throat tighten. He wrote that if I was reading this letter it meant he was no longer sitting across the dinner table from me, and that the house might feel quieter than it ever had before. He wrote that he hoped I would remember how many good years we had shared inside those walls, and that every board, every nail, and every window carried pieces of our life together. Daniel explained that he knew difficult conversations often happened after someone passed away, and that not everyone would see the house the same way we did. Some people would see numbers and property values where we saw memories and family. That was why he wanted things written clearly so no one could place pressure on me during a time when grief might make decisions harder. I turned to the second page of the letter slowly, my heart beating steadily as I read his words. Daniel wrote that he trusted me to decide what the future of the house should be, not anyone else. He explained that the legal documents we completed with the attorney ensured that the house remained entirely under my control. No one could sell it, claim it, or divide it without my direct choice and signature. Beneath the letter sat the document confirming exactly what he described, signed and notarized nearly a year earlier. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, the tension that had been building since the funeral beginning to ease. Ashley believed the future of the house had already been decided. She believed time and pressure would slowly push me aside until the outcome she imagined became real. But Daniel had understood something important long before this day arrived. He knew that assumptions often create conflict inside families, and he had chosen to remove those assumptions completely. As I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope, I realized something that made the quiet house feel steadier again. Ashley might believe she knew how this story would end, but the truth was much simpler. Daniel had already made sure that the final decision would always belong to me.